In the early morning of July 17, 2023, exactly at 3:42 a.m., a Route 82 bus was silently crossing Interstate 10 near West Houston, Texas. The city was still asleep, but inside that empty vehicle, something absolutely out of the ordinary was happening. Seated in the driver's cabin with hands firm on the wheel was Clayton Pierce, 42 years old, an employee of Metro Houston Transit Authority for more than a decade. What no one knew yet was that Clayton wasn't following a regular route that morning. In the undercarriage luggage compartment of the bus, protected by improvised compartments, was $11.2 million in cash, part of a clandestine shipment belonging to the Gulf Cartel. There was no invoice, no way to trace it. None of the cartel members had any idea that, at that exact moment, all the money that should be safely delivered to a criminal cell at the Texas-Mexico border was disappearing. And more than that, it was being taken by a bus driver with no criminal record, no contacts with the criminal world, and apparently no motive at all. Police were only alerted 5 hours later when the bus was found empty and abandoned in a deactivated warehouse in Pearland. No sign of Clayton, no camera caught the switch, no witness saw anything. Within hours, an ordinary man had executed what investigators would classify as the most unlikely and audacious theft in recent Houston history. $11 million, a bus driver, and an escape that would leave one of the most feared Mexican cartels operating in Texas completely humiliated. How did a simple urban transit employee manage to deceive one of the most violent organizations in the country? What was the plan? And more importantly, how did he disappear without leaving a trace? Now let's understand who Clayton Pierce was before the disappearance. Clayton Pierce was born in 1981 in East Houston, in a predominantly Hispanic neighborhood. He grew up in a simple family, son of an electrician and a nursing assistant. From a young age, he was known for his methodical behavior, almost obsessive about schedules and routines. At 17, while his friends were starting to venture into informal work, Clayton had already obtained his commercial driver's license and was doing side gigs as a valet at city events. But his true talent would reveal itself over time. Clayton had an impressive spatial memory. He knew by heart every street, every alternate route, and every bus corridor in the city. He didn't use GPS. He didn't need to. His colleagues said he knew Houston better than Google Maps itself. In 2004, he passed a civil service exam for municipal transit driver. At 23, he was hired by Metro Houston Transit Authority. From that point on, his life entered a rigid routine. He woke up every day at 4 a.m., arrived at the terminal 30 minutes early. He never missed work, never arrived late, never had a single passenger complaint registered against him. Behind the scenes, supervisors said Clayton was the type of employee who did everything by the book. But there was something beyond discipline. He also had an almost uncompromising sense of justice. He had been suspended once for refusing to alter a route to accommodate an unofficial order. He had also reported irregularities within the company, which earned him the respect of some and the antipathy of others. Outside of work, Clayton led a modest life. Married to Jennifer, a licensed vocational nurse, and father to an 8-year-old autistic boy named Dylan, he saved every penny. He lived in a small apartment in East Houston. His expenses were lean, planned. Every month, part of his salary went into a savings account he called the security fund. But what no one knew was that in the last 2 years, this fund had become a true contingency plan. The thing is, Clayton had a problem. His son Dylan needed continuous treatment, expensive and not fully covered by their insurance. With each new consultation, each new evaluation, he saw possibilities narrowing. And even with his exemplary life, he couldn't advance financially. This was his blind spot. It wasn't ambition, it wasn't greed, it was desperation. The line between right and wrong began to blur when Clayton was assigned to special early morning routes, transporting cargo under minimal surveillance. And it was on one of those routes that he noticed something different, something no one else perceived. It all started on an apparently ordinary early morning in April 2023. Clayton had been assigned to a night route connecting downtown Houston to South Houston, passing through lightly trafficked avenues during the early morning hours. The route should have been empty, but that night something caught his attention. At the departure point, a tall man in a dark suit boarded the bus accompanied by 2 others, one of them carrying a large backpack. the type used for deliveries. There was no conversation. They didn't pay fare, just entered, sat in the back and got off 15 minutes later in front of an apparently abandoned industrial warehouse in the South Zone. The detail Clayton noticed, that went unnoticed by any other driver, was that when getting off, one of the men left the backpack open for a second. Inside, stacked with precision, were blocks of brand new $100 bills. The following week, Clayton was assigned to the same route again, and the same group boarded the bus at the same stop with the same behavior pattern. Only this time, it wasn't one, but 4 backpacks. Clayton said nothing, but his brain started working. He mapped the schedules, counted the minutes between boarding and getting off, estimated the weight by the marks the backpacks left on the seats, did mental calculations. If each backpack carried at least $200,000, and this happened 3 times a week, then we were talking about millions in circulation, all inside a municipal bus, outside any official control. In the 3rd week, the pattern changed. The group entered with rolling suitcases, the type used for international travel. There was no more room for doubt. That bus was being used as clandestine cash transport, probably drug money. But Clayton didn't report it because now he knew something no one else knew: the origin, route, and destination of the transport. And more importantly, he realized something that perhaps not even the criminals had noticed. In that operation, there was no armed security, no support vehicle. It was a clean transport precisely to avoid raising suspicion. If someone knew all the schedules, all the gaps, and all the alternate routes, they could disappear with that money, and no one would suspect a municipal driver with a clean record. The following week, Clayton made a decision. He noted the exact schedules, simulated small route changes under the pretext of road construction, tested an alternate route that passed by a deactivated warehouse in Pearland. He began to design a plan, not a robbery, a substitution, a surgical swap. But there was a deadline. In the last week of June, he overheard a conversation between 2 company employees. The contract with that route was about to be terminated. In less than a month, Clayton would be reassigned. If he was going to do something, it had to be soon, and he would only have one chance. And there was another problem. If he failed, the cartel would know his name, his face, his family. Easy ways out disappeared. Now it was all or nothing. Clayton knew he couldn't trust anyone. Not work colleagues, not family members, much less the police. Any slip could put his life and that of his wife and son at immediate risk. The plan would have to be executed entirely by him, without outside help, without witnesses, and above all, without leaving traces. First, he began studying the early morning routes in detail, using his years of knowledge as a driver and his uncommon spatial memory. He mapped 3 alternate routes that could be used to deviate from the official route without raising suspicion. Each of these routes included stretches with few or no public cameras, absence of nighttime policing, and easy access to abandoned industrial areas. Clayton then began doing something unusual. On alternate weeks, he asked to switch routes with colleagues under the pretext of adjusting schedules with his son's school. He did this sporadically, testing which supervisors would accept and which wouldn't. This way, he mapped which nights would be easier to negotiate a last-minute schedule, ensuring flexibility to choose the right moment for the heist. With the warehouse location in Pearland decided, a building deactivated since 2013, previously used by a construction materials distributor, Clayton began visiting the site on his days off. He wore simple clothes, went by bicycle, and behaved like someone simply exploring scrap metal. He found there were no guards. Access was possible through a broken side gate, and most importantly, there was an entrance wide enough for the bus to pass through. Inside, he found a ramp leading down to the basement. The structure was still intact despite the abandonment. He decided that would be the exchange point. Now he needed to understand the behavior of nighttime passengers. For 3 weeks, he noted how many people boarded, at which stops, and at what times. He discovered that in the critical stretch of the route between Airline Drive and Interstate 10, there was a 28-minute window when the bus usually circulated empty. It was in this interval that clandestine transport was done. But there was a risk, the company's own monitoring system. Clayton knew each bus had an internal GPS module, and that any long stop outside the route could be detected. That's why he began studying the system's failure patterns. He simulated 3 technical breakdowns on different shifts, reporting supposed signal problems in the area between North Houston and the transit center. The central office, without resources for constant maintenance, registered the incidents as intermittent network failures. That gave him an opening, a technical justification previously documented for signal loss during the operation. Only one thing was missing: a way to transport the money quickly and safely without drawing attention. That's when Clayton adapted an internal compartment in the bus. During a night maintenance shift, he replaced the wooden plates in the luggage compartment with false panels, with space to hide up to 330 pounds of cargo. Nothing that would compromise the structure, but enough to carry millions. The night before the heist, he left his son with his sister-in-law and told his wife he would work overtime. Jennifer, tired from her hospital routine, didn't question it. Everything was ready. There was only one detail he couldn't control: the amount of money transported that morning. If it was less than expected, the risk might not be worth it. If it was more, the plan could fail. But Clayton was decided. That night, he wouldn't just be a driver. He would be the architect of one of the most audacious escapes in recent Houston history. In the early morning of July 17, 2023, at 2:58 a.m., Clayton parked the Route 82 bus at the initial stop at the downtown transit center. He arrived with the calmness of someone who had done this 100 times before. He wore the company's blue uniform, a simple digital watch on his wrist, and a small communicator radio on the dashboard, standard for night drivers. At 3:07 a.m., the special passengers boarded the bus, as they always did, without saying a word, each with a black, rolling suitcase. They didn't look at Clayton, just sat down. The first milestone was met. He was transporting the complete shipment. By appearance and volume, he calculated between $10 and $12 million. Everything was as predicted. The bus continued through the dark roads of West Houston. Clayton didn't look back. He maintained the normal route until the point on Westheimer Road. There, he should encounter a traffic blockage he had simulated the night before, cones and signs indicating emergency construction positioned by himself. At 3:22 a.m., he activated manual operation mode on the route monitoring system, a function used for emergencies. A small delay in communication with the central office would be considered normal. The bus then detoured onto Richmond Avenue, taking a path only he knew. The first part of the escape had begun. The detour led the bus through a corridor of deactivated warehouses, where public cameras were inactive or pointed at other locations. Clayton knew this because he had passed there dozens of times during tests. At 3:31 a.m., he stopped the vehicle in front of the warehouse in Pearland. He jumped from the cabin, opened the side gate with a crowbar hidden in the dashboard, and maneuvered the bus inside with the precision of someone who had already rehearsed this, like a choreographer rehearsing a piece. Once inside, in absolute silence, he pulled the vehicle into the basement down the dusty ramp. Once in the interior, he turned off the lights, electronically locked the doors, and got out. Time was tight. He knew he had a maximum of 25 minutes before the central office tried to make contact. He ran to the lower luggage compartment, opened the compartments, and began transferring the suitcases. Each one was heavier than he had anticipated. Sweat ran down his face, but he forced himself to maintain the pace. 5 suitcases, 6, 7. On the 8th, he heard something. A sharp noise on the upper floor. Footsteps. Someone was there. He froze for a second, heart pounding like a drum. He grabbed a tire iron and walked silently to the metal staircase leading to the ground floor. He climbed 2 steps, stopped. Silence. He took a deep breath. Probably some animal or his mind playing tricks. He went back, locked the suitcases in the hidden compartment, and covered them with the false structure. At 3:52 a.m., he left the warehouse with the bus, closed the gate, cleaned the tires with a cloth soaked in diesel fuel to not leave marks on the asphalt, and returned to the official route as if nothing had happened. At 4:11 a.m., the bus was approaching the point where the men should get off with the suitcases at the same warehouse where they always left them. They stood up at the usual time. Clayton stopped exactly where he stopped every week, but this time, no one was waiting. The warehouse gate was locked. The men looked at each other. One of them pulled out his cell phone and called someone. Tension rose. Clayton watched through the rearview mirror, feigning ignorance. One of the men walked to the cabin and asked, "You sure this is the place?" And Clayton answered calmly, "It's always been here, sir. I didn't receive any different instructions." The man frowned, checked his phone once more, and signaled to the others. They got off, talked briefly, and left on foot, visibly upset. Clayton closed the doors. He was sweating. He knew what that meant. There was something wrong with their operation. Someone had failed on the other side, and that could trigger an alarm within the cartel. With the men off the bus, Clayton accelerated and headed to the final terminal, where he should end his shift. During the journey, he activated the telemetry error system on the dashboard, which erased GPS records for 15 minutes, an old bug he had learned to manipulate. Upon arriving at the terminal, he handed the bus to the next driver without showing any sign of nervousness. He took an Uber to a parking lot in East Houston, where he had left days before an old van with documentation in a shell identity's name. In the back of the van, he had installed a metal structure to fit the suitcases without them moving during transport. He returned to the warehouse with the van at 5:25 a.m. There, he transferred the suitcases from the luggage compartment to the vehicle, one by one. In total, 12 suitcases. They were heavy. They were intact. At 6:17 a.m., Clayton left the warehouse and headed to the interior of the state via Interstate 45, then took Highway 290, avoided tolls with cameras, used rural detours. At 8:43 a.m., he arrived at the final destination, a deactivated ranch in Huntsville, Texas, belonging to the grandfather of an old childhood friend who had died 5 years ago. The property was never transferred. Officially, it was in legal dispute. No one had been there in years. Clayton buried the suitcases in a concrete compartment in the old tool shed. He cemented the entrance, hid the traces, and there he disappeared. That morning, as the city was still waking up, the news began to spread. A bus had temporarily disappeared. The cartel men were on alert, and the transit company couldn't explain the system failure. But Clayton was no longer in Houston. $11.2 million in cash had changed hands. The night following the bus disappearance, the climate in Houston's criminal underworld was already one of war. One of the leaders of the cell responsible for the Gulf Cartel's financial operation in the Capitol border axis was summoned to account. The missing amount was so high that it exceeded even what certain managers moved in an entire year. The cartel, which operates with almost military discipline, doesn't forgive failures. And that wasn't considered a common loss, it was humiliation. A bus driver, civilian, no record, no contacts, had beaten one of the most feared organizations operating in the country. It was inadmissible. In less than 48 hours, retaliation began. The group that boarded the bus that morning was summarily eliminated. 3 bodies were found in Lake Houston with clear signs of execution. None of them even had time to say what they knew. Simultaneously, the cartel's intelligence sector was mobilized. Public cameras, clandestine access to Metro Houston data, informal monitoring of stations and terminals. In a short time, they arrived at a name, Clayton Pierce. But here arose the first obstacle for them. Clayton had disappeared completely. No hotel records, no card usage, no cell phone activity. Not even his relatives knew his whereabouts. His wife, Jennifer, gave confused, shocked testimony. She cried but told the truth. She didn't know where he was. Their son was in his sister-in-law's care. The cartel then changed strategy. They began investigating Clayton's life step by step. They searched every address where he had lived, every distant relative, every childhood friendship. And it was in this search that they discovered something. An old friend of Clayton's, dead for years, had left a ranch in the interior with no legal movement. One of the cartel's enforcers was sent to the location to check, but upon arriving found the gate locked with a new padlock. The workshop floor had been recently cemented. It was enough. The cartel marked the location. They would return. At the same time, the Houston Police Department, pressured by the case's repercussion and the clear infiltration of the cartel in municipal transport, opened a parallel investigation. An experienced detective from the organized crime unit was assigned, and by cross-referencing GPS information, system failures, and Clayton's old complaints against the company itself, he reached the same conclusion. The driver wasn't a simple employee. He had premeditated this. The media began reporting the case. The man who robbed the cartel. $11 million disappeared. Silent heist. This only increased the pressure. Now Clayton faced a double siege. On one side, the cartel hunted him with rage. On the other, police sought him as the central suspect in a high-impact crime. In hiding, Clayton followed everything through a battery-powered radio and local newspapers. He knew time was running out. He knew it was a matter of days before they found the ranch and that if he didn't act, he would end up dead or arrested. It was at that moment that he made the most difficult decision of his life: sacrifice his personal security to do something bigger. Clayton handwrote a letter, addressed it to an investigative reporter he had followed for years and trusted. In the envelope, he included copies of photos of the suitcases, a detailed description of how the Gulf Cartel operated the transfers, and the exact location of 2 other collection points used by the organization. He knew this would set the system on fire. He also knew that after this there would be no turning back, but he did it anyway. The letter arrived at the Houston Chronicle newsroom on the morning of July 22, 2023. The envelope was simple, handwritten, no return address. Journalist Robert Morrison, known for reports on corruption and organized crime, found it curious but almost threw it away. He only didn't because when he opened it, he saw the contents. Photos of open suitcases of money, with dates written on papers beside them, serial numbers of bills, and information about the logistics structure of financial transport used by the cartel on bus routes. There were names of complicit drivers, route schedules, delivery locations, and even an estimate of monthly cash flow, almost $5 million per week, according to the letter. But what caught the most attention was the final passage, written in firm letters. If you publish this, you won't just understand what happened, you'll be able to stop the cycle and maybe save other lives. I didn't do this for money. I did it because no one listened while I tried to do it the right way. It was Clayton, confessing everything, not to the police, not to the criminals, but to society. The journalist took the material straight to the organized crime unit. Agents organized a sweep operation at strategic terminals. In a single night, they intercepted 2 drivers transporting almost $3 million in hidden compartments in buses. The cartel had to temporarily interrupt its transport operation via municipal routes, something that hadn't happened in more than a decade. The media exploded with the revelation. Clayton's name wasn't officially released, but rumors soon emerged. He was the transit vigilante, the man who single-handedly dismantled one of the most discreet financial gears of the Gulf Cartel. But what about Clayton? He was never found. The ranch in Huntsville was invaded 3 days after the letter was published. It was empty. The suitcases were no longer there. In place of the cement floor that previously hid the money, there was only a dugout hole and traces that someone had left in a hurry. No sign of struggle, no indication of destination. The money never appeared. Some believe he fled to another state. Others say he crossed the border and lives hidden in the interior of Mexico or Central America. There are even those who say he was killed by the cartel and that his letter was the last attempt to bring justice before the end. But the truth is that in a system where corruption, fear, and impunity go hand in hand, an ordinary bus driver with a sick child and an unshakable moral code managed, alone, to do more than many police operations. He changed the game, exposed the failures, and for a moment, won. Clayton Pierce disappeared, but his act became legend on the streets of Houston, a living reminder that sometimes competence, courage, and desperation can be powerful weapons in the hands of those no one expects.